Hello, friends. Welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Really glad to have you. Happy holidays, by the way, everyone. If Merry Christmas is your thing, that too. Going to be talking today with Randy Woodley. Randy's been a friend for a long time. He's written a book called The Harmony Tree about healing and community. When I asked him if it was a kid's book, he said, well, I like to think of it is a children's book, but I like to think about it as a book that adults will read and kids will like. It's a great way to think about it. Randy is a professor of indigenous studies at George Fox University, George Fox Seminary in Portland, Oregon area. He is an indigenous person. He's a scholar. He is a really bright thinker. This is a 45-minute or so conversation, and toward the end, it gets really fun, at least for people like me with the kind of sensibilities that Randy and I have. We talk about some things that we found to be quite exciting. So I hope you really enjoy it. Really do go pick this book up. It's worth reading. It's beautifully illustrated. We talk a bit about that. It's a great message. It's called The Harmony Tree, and it would be worth your time with your children or other people in your life to endeavor in this book. There's a whole movement of people who want a different kind of a world, writing children's books and doing some beautiful illustrations and animations in them for communicating their message. I think it's part of the future. You know what else is part of the future? This podcast, if you go over to Patreon and chip in. So go to DougPagitt.com if you want to chip in, especially here at the holiday times, to just have that extra bonus to somehow make your life more full. Anyway, I appreciate your listening, whether you are a patron or not. Here it is, my conversation with Randy Woodley. Doug Pagitt here, talking with Randy Woodley, and Randy has put together a spectacular children's book. We're going to talk about that, a book for adults that kids like, or that they might enjoy. Randy, as I mentioned to you, I have to go on and update the Facebook settings so that people can share this, including you and others. They can share it around the internet, and we'd love for people to do that. So if you're watching now on Facebook and you want to share this with people that you care about, because the things you care about, they care about, we'd love to have you do that. Randy, tell me a little bit about this book. You are a man of many skills, my friend. You do,
what do they say? I have an interest in all, a master of none.
There you go. Like I love it.
Yeah. So, I wrote the book Shalom in the Community of Creation and Indigenous Vision back in, I think it was 2010 or 12. And then I got the idea for several reasons. There are really about 5 different reasons why I decided to write this in a children's book. But it came to me one day, and I thought I can tell a similar story as Shalom that's even more easily understood, both by children and adults. So,
now, have you ever endeavored into a children's book before? I mean, I know you're a man of many books, PhD, and big fancy learner, and all those things.
No, I have grandchildren, and I had children, 4 kids, and I didn't realize how utterly almost impossible it is to get a book published in the children's market.
Really?
It seemed like that would be easy, and it was not. Yeah.
Because people don't know if you can sell books to children, like if you're not the certain children's author. Is that the?
It's sort of like you're just a whole different market. No one even wanted to talk to me unless I had an agent.
Mm-hmm.
And I never got an agent, but finally it was the Mennonites of Canada who actually sort of lended a hand on this.
Saved by the Canadians again.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So the Harmony Tree, as we were talking before we got on, I said I was trying hard to not type in things like the Giving Tree and the Hope Tree and the Big Tree. There are a lot of books written for children and adults alike that use the notion of a tree. Talk a bit about what in the Harmony Tree, your book. Why you use tree?
Well, the tree is something that kids just love and relate to. They like to see them. They like to climb on them. They like to pick fruit from them. And so, I guess it's just one of those sort of things that we are just really close to in sort of our primal self. And so I think that's a safe thing for kids to think about a big tree, and then of course you have to think of what kind. But but one of the things that was an impetus to creating this book was a particular oak tree on our property in Kentucky. And there's a probably 350-year-old oak that was left there, and everything else was clear cut back probably around 1900 or so. And they left that one tree. And so as I began to think about that was one of the things that one of the streams that led into this is that, I always was just really thankful that tree was still there, and they left one. I don't know why they left one. Maybe one of their kids was climbing in it at the time they were starting to cut things down. I don't know.
That's a good image.
But there it stood, and so that became sort of the focus of this grandmother oak is the focus of the book.
Mm-hmm. So in the inscription at the beginning, there's a dedication. It's a really sweet. It says to my grandchildren, and to yours, and to theirs. And I think that really captures something not only about the book, but about how you think about the world and what you're wanting to say in the world. Can you say a bit about that 3-generational thing?
Yeah, and it's about the future. It's about ecology. It's about animating creation for children in a Western worldview, and it's primarily though about how do host people and settler people get along. And so, what I'm really talking in that dedication about is settler peoples and host peoples and their children together, and how they might see a better future together. And that's sort of what the book is about. I based it on this idea of how do settler folk and how to host people sort of get along, and it's the metaphor of the tree that I use. But there's a couple more reasons that I wrote it. I also wrote it from an ecological perspective, right? And then that's really important to keep emphasizing to children. And then the other thing is just the fact that in a Western worldview, kids are having a hard time the way that they're taught to understand creation or nature as animated. They, we my wife and I, because we had 4 kids that went through school, and of course, when they find out they have Native parents, it's always, can you come in around November or Thanksgiving and talk to us?
You get really busy in the fall, right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
So we would come in, and often I would tell stories, and sometimes those stories would be about animals who got together. And in 3 different times in our times that we went to our children's schools, all the many times, little white boys, all 3 times, said to us something like, "Animals don't talk." And I wondered about that for so long. I was like, what is it? What's going on? It's this worldview that says, if you start off talking about animals talking and you don't start off by saying once upon a time, they don't have permission to understand that. And so there's this sort of like worldview that they have to put it in that says this is a pretend, right? Whereas I think the creation, as God has put it here for us, is all animated. It all has life. And so to begin to understand life in terms of these things that people would call objects, right? Or to see trees for more than, what they're worth per board foot, that sort of thing. So that was a sort of a major reason why, too, I wanted these children in the future to just begin to have a slight influence on that worldview.
Now, you used some language earlier that I really liked. You referred to some people as settlers and some people as hosts, and saying that the settlers and the hosts have to have a way to get along. That's not language that most people use or are familiar with. So I really like it. I think it's really helpful for how people can think about what they're getting. Can you talk a bit about that, either from your children's book perspective or your more scholarly and theological perspective? What is it you're getting at with settlers and hosts, and how comfortable are you with those phrases now?
Yeah, so that's pretty much when you crawl inside my head, that's what you find. There are these categories, right? So, and basically all that those categories do is acknowledge the fact that almost all land in America is stolen land. That it took an ethnic cleansing and an attempted genocide to be settled. And so, we look back now, however many generations, and And it's very difficult to say, well, this is any one person's fault. Now, that's not what it's about. But we still have to recognize that for, perhaps 25, 28,000 years, in most parts of the places where we live and where we have our churches and our schools, we're all at one time inhabited by one or several peoples who were host peoples, who lived with this land, who understood how the whole environment together works and how it's related and how they are related to it. And so those categories are what I keep as a reminder to myself and to others that there is something that often is unspoken and unseen that needs to be remembered. And that is that there are host people everywhere. And there are people who settled everywhere. And it's not easily to divide. I myself am very mixed blood heritage from all kinds of peoples. But I've always understood myself as an indigenous person. So, and it's not to divide. Those categories aren't to divide people. They're actually for us to sort of like understand history in maybe a truer way or a more factual way.
Yeah, I like that. It's like describing a relationship between people. And the word host, that's a great word, I think. Because so often, the emphasis, at least the way that I hear the stories of the taking of this land, always begins with the settlers, right? That's the starting point. And somehow hosts and settlers kind of starts with the host.
And I teach American church history is one of the things I teach 2-3 times a year, and I always begin with the first week is always America before Columbus, and then the second week is the Pilgrims meet the Indians, right? So America before Columbus is all about the incredible populations of the literally anywhere from 120 to 160 million people who inhabited North America, to the ingenious sort of things that they developed and inventions and innovations and the technology and the cities and, the large palladiums and stadiums and, all of these things that were here. In every single class I ever have taught that, always one student will say something like, why didn't I learn this in school? And I say, you weren't supposed to.
Oh.
And
I thought you were going to say you are in school. That's what do you think you're doing here, student?
Yeah, the American myth is that you're not supposed to know that history. Right?
Yeah. What do you think that's about? That because I think that's part of what you're doing with this book, right? In trying to say to children, there's another story that you should know. Why do you think it is that, or why is it that you say it in a way that you shouldn't know it?
Because in order to keep the American myth, which to me is actually, I believe, the strongest religion in the whole United States, this idea that, we are this people and not all peoples, the idea that we have to march forward in progress by, destroying the environment and building up the military and all those kinds of things, in order to have a progressive civilization. When you understand indigenous people, the values, how we live, not perfect by any means, right? But 12 to 25,000 years to get it right on this land, it takes a lot of hubris, a lot of pride to say, well, we don't need to know about that, right? And then the fact that host people are still here. And most people don't even know who the host people are in the land that they're on, right? It's and they don't realize, if they even do know that, they think, well, that was some people of the past, not some people who are still here.
In the book, you've done had someone do some really great illustrations and tried to bring the imagery alive. We don't have a picture of that here, of course, but can you talk about that a bit? That because I think it also ties into all of this, like what we see and not just the words that we hear. There seems to be this whole narrative about the full senses of a human being.
Yeah. So I waited over 2 years to find the right illustrator for this book. I knew the feel that I wanted to have happen in the book I didn't know exactly how I wanted things drawn because I'm not an artist. I'm more of a word person. But I waited and waited, and finally, my nephew, who I've adopted as an Indian way, and our nephew, we're always expanding our relationships, who's a translator in Japan, and he's Cherokee, Mexican, American, and I looked at his art one day, and I said, "Hey, could you draw an oak tree for me?" And so we sort of went from there, and basically, I just described to him what sort of image I see, and he drew them, and it was the match made in heaven. It just felt like this is what I've been waiting for these years for this to happen. And so I'm really excited. And I just actually day before yesterday, spoiler alert, I just got the idea for a sequel, and Ramon said that he would definitely be willing to do the art for the sequel as well. So.
Is it going to be teen fiction? Are you going to follow a generation all the way up and write some?
I actually have a
saucy teen stuff.
A fiction trilogy that I've been working on for a while, but
is that right?
That needs I need like 3 months in the woods somewhere to do that. So,
Randy, I've never talked to a author of a children's book before, so I don't. How does that process work between the story and the illustration? How does that come about? Because it seems there's something important there for people to recognize and learn about, sort of that flow right between the imagery of life and the illustrations and the animations and the words that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think we talk about sometimes the artist's soul, right? Real artists think a little differently than most people. And perceived differently. I think that's the thing. And so I think I have an artist's soul. I just don't have the mechanics that go with it. So I was able to, through talking with Ramon and going back and forth about the story, for him to grasp the story, I think that was the most important thing. Where are the values? Where we're trying to go with it? How much religious imagery do we want in it? Do we want to offend non-Christian people? Do we want to offend Christian people who think it's not enough? So all of those balances, and there are a few things in there that are pretty well. And of course, Walter Brueggemann wrote the afterword for it. So so I sort of covered my bases with all the people who recommended that. We've quite a list of people who endorsed it, but. And it just felt natural with Ramon. There really wasn't a whole lot of. I think there was only one illustration that he did that I said, no, I don't think that really fits. But the rest, it just clicked. It's sort of like when you write with a co-author sometimes, and you just know, okay, this works, and then some other times it just feels like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And this worked. So. Yeah, it's more than an intellectual process,
So give people a snippet of the story itself. When you say to someone, I wrote this book for adults that children might like, called The Harmony Tree, and it's a story about community, it's about life, it's about people. Can you talk a bit about how you describe it?
Yeah, so there are no human beings in the whole story. It starts off with this sort of like, in a lot of ways, the way Genesis starts out, with this sort of balanced world and nature and mentioning some of the species that have now gone extinct, like the ivory-billed woodpecker and other things, and the passenger pigeon and others, and sort of how that works in balance and in harmony. And then there comes this awful noise, and it's basically it's never called chainsaws, but it's this horrible buzzing sound, and all the trees are clear cut except for this one oak, which is exactly what happened on my property as I imagined it, and in Kentucky there, and then it's sad. Every time the grandmother oak lets her acorns down and they begin to finally come into decent-sized trees for her children, they're coming cut down again. and eventually these trees are replaced, and there's basically, you can see sort of the outskirts of a subdivision with all these maples that are put up in their place, and the maples sort of alienate Grandmother Oak when she tries to talk to them.
Yeah.
And they're finally confronted by Grandmother Oak, and she says, well, because they say, well, this is our land, we've always been here. And so Grandmother Oak just asks them the question, well, if this is your land, tell me your stories. But all their stories were from other places. And so then the storms come.
I see what you're doing there. I see what you're doing there. That's good.
Yeah. The storms come. The other trees' roots are not deep enough. And so they begin to blow off. And as soon as they lose branches, people come cut them down and plant another one. And sort of this expendable culture, right? And then finally, they have nowhere else to turn except for Grandmother Oak. And they ask her to tell the stories of this land. And as they do, their roots begin to get deeper. And so they start to literally assimilate into the stories of this land with permission from Grandmother Oak. And then sort of as she's telling them the story, finally an acorn drops to the ground, and they all stop. And what was that? And she says, it was just because she had stopped giving acorns after a long time. And and then she says, that was just one of my acorns hitting the ground. And so you can see the analogy when we talk about host and settler peoples, that Native people have wisdom through experience to share. And they've just been waiting for people to listen.
What is so when a child, understands this storyline and it taps into that truth that they know is in them before it's been sort of removed from their structure, people get this story and they get the justice and injustice that's in it. As people grow older and they try to navigate the realities of the world that we all live in, what is the best way for, those maples to tap into the root system of the oaks in the world in the world that we live in? Because it's really hard, and it's not a clear path for a lot of people to even know where or how they would properly engage with someone, and there's lots of sensitivities all around. There's real fear of cultural appropriation that really matters, and there's also fears of not wanting to exploit people or make indigenous Native peoples here have to explain to non-indigenous people the life of indigenous people. They should figure it out on their own. That narrative that's going, there's just a lot happening. So these kids that are going to get this story and have it ring true, what's the best advice you have for how someone can navigate all the complexities that exist in our world as far as understanding the deep history of the others?
I do have advice in that regard, but first thing I want to say is that the children, I sort of wrote it at a word level, if you will, for about ages 6 to 11. So they're going to get the trees talk message, and they're going to get the environmental message probably right away. It may be, when they look back at the book when they're 10 years old or 12 years old, that they sort of, or that their parents point out to them.
Yeah, the parents point out to them, right? That's right.
So
at least I'm hoping so. I'm hoping parents will take this seriously. And
I've just gotten a whole lot of really generous comments from people who say, that's why I say it's a book written for adults that children enjoy, because a lot of people have talked about how much their kids enjoy them, but they also enjoy it themselves. And so,
and just a little plug here. This is the season that people tend to buy books for kids and for adults. So if people are thinking of this, they should look up the Harmony Tree and order it right now for the holiday season.
It just hit me the other day. I told my wife, hey, we haven't even advertised our children's books, so we should probably put that on somewhere.
Should probably tell people that there's a children's book, because they're wandering around stores looking for children's books.
And it is, my whole life has been spent toward the same goal as this children's book points to, and that is to develop the relationships between host people and settler peoples. So, so how that's done practically, that's a really important question, and not easily answered, because one of the things that you learn in Indian country is that you really can't get anywhere, or everything is done sort of through permission, right? So that it's not appropriated.
Yep.
And this is among Native people. And so people are taught, they're mentored, they're asked permissions, that you have to make yourself vulnerable in order to receive something. And that's a really difficult thing in our culture, is to make ourselves vulnerable. And for me, to me, that is actually the meta characteristic of who the creator is. God is the most vulnerable being that exists. So because of that vulnerability, I think we are at our most spiritual time when we too are vulnerable. And because we're the most human then, right?
Right.
But how do we get in the place where we do that? Before it's sort of like right now we've got this impending environmental disaster that's coming about us, and we should be including, every state should be including indigenous people, traditional peoples in their talks when it comes to understanding what's going on with the environment, because there's a lot of a different perspective than they will hear from others. So how does this happen? I think number one, educating yourself about whose land you're actually on, who's there for thousands of years, right. And then where are those people now, and what are their stories, and then the way to get out of appropriation is to simply say, what kinds of values were developed during those thousands and thousands of years? The values toward other people, toward diversity, toward the environment, toward the creator. And so it just happened that because of this, that when I did my PhD, my dissertation was about indigenous values, and what Walter Brueggemann calls this sort of meta narrative of shalom throughout the whole scriptures. But what we all have words for, and I found 45 tribes across the United States, and that was all that I was able to query. But all 45 had a similar construction to shalom, and they're called different things. In Navajo they're called hojon, in Cherokee it's called Elohe or Deyukti. But they all sort of point to this harmony way, which is also just the sort of, it's for the common good, right?
Yeah.
Is
that the English? Would that be your suggestion of the English word for that? The kind of the populist, kind of Americana English word? For shalom? Would it be harmony or
well-being, perhaps? Well-being. But it's bigger than personal well-being, right? It's all about community and about the land and about the weather and about so shalom is not, and well-being, I don't think, is a concept that is about an individual as much as it is about a group or a community. So one of the things I like that Brueggemann says is that if half of the community is well fed and half are not fed, then no one has shalom. And I think that value crosses over into all the indigenous peoples, and not just America. We had the 45 tribes that I found this construct. They all had the construct, and I found 10 values that all were together and matching. And these values are values that we all would want to live by, right? And so I don't think it is. I think it's actually a gift that people begin to say, how do I live by those same values? I don't have to appropriate the ceremonies. I don't, although, in most Native communities, non-natives are welcome to most of their things, not all their things, but most of their things like powwows and celebrations.
Really? Now I think that's a good reminder for people to know. I was having this conversation in the fall with some families who were talking about their interest in connecting with some indigenous peoples here in western Minnesota and eastern South Dakota, and they just didn't know if they should go to a powwow. They weren't sure. They knew that maybe it was public, but they didn't know if that meant them. And they're wanting to be appropriate and not appropriate.
Absolutely. But again, it's that putting yourself out there in a little vulnerable position. Yeah. It's like, I'm going to show up even if I don't know. and almost always somebody's going to welcome you, right? I mean, especially if there's an older person around or whatever, because and I understand, because there's been such travesty done to our native people that people think, well, geez, the last thing they want to do is talk to a white person, right?
Right.
But, I was really fortunate in my life to have early on spent a lot of time with really old elders. I mean, these are what I call the true elders, some who were even actually born in a teepee. One woman who was born in Geronimo's prison time in Florida. And these people, I make a difference between that and what I sometimes call neo-elders, because they're the most gracious, tolerant, forgiving people on the planet. And I think if given a chance, that's a wonderful gift of grace that it's an exchange that can happen between people. So if we just go, oh, I don't want to take a chance, then we're really missing out on maybe something that would be a great blessing to us.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really great advice to start with that part that's true in you, the shalom, the shared harmony, and to recognize that's in other people's as well. And that's the place that you're trying to connect. That's what I hear you saying, is find those places, that which is true in you. So you're not approaching someone else with the attitude that you have something for me. You say we share something together and we can exchange we can have this wonderful exchange, which, funny enough, like that's the thing that when I was a kid, I remember in fourth grade for some reason, maybe it's because we did this that's what you do in fourth grade, but that was the big thing about like the Pilgrims, and the way we talked about then was the Pilgrims and the Indians, that the Pilgrims and Indians had this real exchange and they understood each other. And then it was later that I began to realize, oh no, that wasn't a fair exchange at all. That was that was something else. So people like me, at least of my generation, and maybe younger people as well, they really feel like, oh, all that exchange stuff that ever happened in the previous history of these communities, that was all a ruse. And
there are some myths that might be worth building on, and there was actually some. It's true that the Pilgrim story is told a little differently than it happened. And that the results much later in the next generation were really dire for indigenous peoples. But there actually was a coming together and a celebration and a feast and probably a lot of drinking beer, because that's what most of the settlers drank at that time. That was their number one.
Yeah, that's how they kept water clean, right?
Yeah.
To ferment
so
it.
They come from England where the water wasn't so clean, and so So I think there are myths and there are some good examples that we really need to build and reimagine what it means to live together, and not just with indigenous peoples, right? With all peoples together, that we begin to reimagine together a new narrative rather than the one that's built on sort of one culture dominating the rest.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of the first step, I think, is maybe to recognize the giftedness that the indigenous people already have. And that's the point of the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's, you've probably spent time around this, but there's all this conversation in kind of popular world about the way that trees communicate with each other. And what we're learning, even about the science of that and how information is moved and how resources under the root system are moved, and that a tree will give up some of its own life and energy so that another tree that's sick can be like, there's some kind of a communicate. It's not just a metaphor. It's
absolutely.
What we would call true communication and all that. Was that going on for you, that the Life of Trees book? And
well, I've sort of always kind of understood that to some level. I teach a class every other year that's called Theology and Ethic of the Land. And the one of the books I came across this year was called The Secret Life of Trees.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, oh, I knew a lot of this stuff. And David Suzuki had written a number of things about these kinds of things. But I used to, as a kid, I would go down by the creek and I'd lay down on the land, and it'd be a very spiritual time, even though I didn't even realize what was going on, that I was sort of absorbing somehow the ethos of the land, and understanding that the trees have this relationship to others and to me and to the animals, and now my wife and I are permaculture farmers, so planters. We call ourselves, we're mostly planting, but and we also have a seed company, and so what we realize more and more are the relationships, and one of the things that creates health in the forest is biodiversity. And so I talk about, so right across from me, I'm looking at it right now, is I'm surrounded on three sides by this monocultural blight of filbert trees, or most people know them as hazelnuts. They're all half dead.
This is on your farm in outside of Portland. Yeah. Yeah.
Just looking at this is just outside. We're this sort of little biodiverse oasis in the midst of this thing, 4 acres. And these things are all, it's unhealthy soil. It's the trees are half dead. They have to sort of keep them alive through artificial means and spray all the time. And this is not how the world operates. It doesn't operate in a sort of homogeneous fashion. Things thrive and produce health for each other when there's biodiversity. And I think that's just one of those lessons for humans as well. Yeah, that we can get too saturated and inculcated and have blinders on in our own selves, and so it's necessary that we hear from people who are different than us.
Yeah, boy, that's just such a fascinating way to think about your words at the start of this with hosts and with settlers. That one way to tell the story is human migration around the planet should be adding diversity, and that diversity should make us stronger, and you shouldn't be blighting pieces of the land. That there's a whole other imagination that doesn't keep people apart, but says, there's something really, but you have to do diversity in the right way, because some crops, some plants, some trees, they just take over all the space from all the other trees. Like even in nature, not everything is designed to operate equally. There's a lot of dominance and takeover.
Another thing I should bring up, which I think is sometimes forgotten, and because of, you mentioned the globalization and our moving around, and we do that in our country, and I've lived in so many places. My people are originally from the Southeast. I live in Western Oregon, up in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm a settler here. So, and my wife, who's a Shoshone from Wyoming, from the Wind River Reservation, she's a settler here. We are settlers in a land that we don't know. It's not the land that we of our stories and our ceremonies and all of those things. And so we are searching and seeking a relationship with the host peoples of this area, just like anyone else is.
That's so interesting, because the way, all the years I've known you, the way you describe how someone understands where they're from is based on the land. And a lot of us were taught to describe that based on some other category, like an ethnic group or a nationality. Like maybe it was connected to a land, but not really the soil or the trees or the bushes, like the land. There's this overlay of some other, I don't know, like way that humanity understands its migration patterns. And you have a way of seeing the world that's understands a physical, like almost like you're suggesting that humanity is a physical thing and not just a cognitive sort of category, and that it's related to physical places, that there's a physicality in all of that is really lost on a lot of us. We don't think about. I'm even thinking about new kinds of spirituality that people are approaching in new ways and are really helpful for them. A lot of it is spirituality that kind of pulls people into a very cosmic sense of the universe, which I really like. I'm a big fan of all that. But boy, the shadowy side of that is that it keeps you, it makes you part of the universe and not part of the soil and the land and all that. Do you have thoughts about that, and even how that connects to them?
Absolutely. So I just did last night a I don't want to say lecture, but I led a group of architects discussing, big words, ready, biophilic design and the use of light in darkness. Yeah. And so the biophilic just means the love of nature. Yeah. And we're talking about how to understand shades of light and shades of darkness in architecture and how our bodies respond and all those kinds of things.
Nice. Very Advent of you.
Yeah. I love architecture, but one of the things that I began with is to talk about there's a few things that we don't understand, and it's true in just about every field in the West. It's true in theology, absolutely. It's true in architecture, and we could find lots of places to put this, and that is that sort of our Western worldview comes down, of course, from with almost embedded without escaping until you finally realize with a dualistic understanding of life. So the spiritual or the mental is always at a higher plane or higher value than the physical, right? And of course, that's not good theology. It's not good architecture. And so we have to sort of decolonize ourselves, because what happens in the colonization process is that we take on the universal and say that fits everywhere. So it disregards what's local. It disregards local architecture. It disregards local theology, local governance, local. And so, and what then it says is that what I believe has an inherent right to trump what anyone local believes. So I always talk about if we can build the same house, for example, in architecture, we don't have to talk about theology, but we could do either one. We build the same house anywhere in the country. That's a very colonial process, and it's a very hierarchical process that says there's one group whose values, whoever that house reflects, is higher than anyone else's. And so that's the route that we have to take. There's this sort of certitude with it. Whereas if we understand, again, to quote Brueggemann, land is the central theme of the Bible. Trying to...
That's worth hanging on to for a second. The land is the central theme in the Bible.
Land is the central theme of the Bible. Yeah. And I always tell people when I'm talking about missiology or theology or whatever I'm talking about, I say, we are concerned about time because we use time as a universal and it replaces place. But God is concerned about place and about not just geography of place, but the spirit of place, if you will, the soul of the place, the social history of the place, and how that interplays with the geography and what's happened there. And so it calls for us to actually be more spiritual than what the Western worldview would want us to be. And I think to be more spiritual is what exactly our Creator wants us to be.
Right.
So and to be spiritual is just to recognize what is human around us and the environment we live in, and to pay attention to that. So it cuts through that dualism.
And all of that is manifest in the 43 pages of the children's book, The Harmony Tree.
Maybe if you do the interview with it.
That's right. Well, Randy, thank you so much. Thanks for the book. Thanks for being willing to share with me and with others. It's really great. Is there a best way for people to buy it if they're thinking now, I am going to endeavor into that children's book? Is there a place that's better for you if they buy in that way?
Well, there's Amazon, of course. I don't currently have any books here, so I can't do that. I wouldn't have time to mail them and all that anyway. But so there's Amazon, and there's Friesen Press, and they have the books available there. And I think they're both similar in price. Amazon, if you have Prime, of course, you wouldn't have to pay for shipping. But but Friesen has them, and once in a while, I hear Amazon people say they have to wait a little while because they sell out. But
they sell through.
But either Friesen or Amazon are probably the best places. And then I would tell people if you want to, if you read that and you like the message, to tell your local bookstores, hey, start carrying this children's book. It's really important.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I appreciate you hosting this, Doug. So this is a wonderful gift at Christmas time. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you are welcome. You're a wonderful gift at Christmas time, fella. Thanks for it. So the book again is called The Harmony Tree, A Story of Community and Healing. Is that right? Did I get the subtitle right?
Of healing and community. And it's about bringing us together.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, buddy.
Okay, Doug. Thanks.